oftentimes what we end up doing in these studies is kind of busting myths and things like that. So there's a lot of hype around the lengthened partial training at the moment, and whether it does or does not optimize hypertrophy, particularly in trained individuals. And there's a feeling of oh, don't come over here with your rigorous science data that dashes all of our hopes.
Stop being so negative, James. God.
Yeah, exactly. Let us obsess about the lengthened partials and this, that, and the other. And incredibly, the magnitude of effects that we saw for both hypertrophy and for strength were incredibly close to what we predicted.
Lawrence Steele here, and welcome back to High Intensity Business, your one-stop shop for growing your HIIT business and fueling your passion for high-intensity strength training. Today, we welcome back Dr. James Steele. It's been a long time. James has been on the podcast many times in the past. James is a previous associate professor at Southampton University in the UK. He is currently head of research for Keyser Australia and director at Steele Research Limited, providing research, statistics, and data consultancy. James, welcome back to the podcast.
A pleasure to be back on, Lawrence. Always good to catch up.
Likewise. I'm really excited about this one today. We haven't spoken for a while. I can see the cat's back.
It's just arrived. Are you going to be quiet? Are you going to settle down?
She couldn't afford to miss this important conversation. So obviously today we're going to be exploring a study which you did relatively recently called The Effects of Lengthened Partial Range of Motion Resistance Training of the Limbs on Arm and Thigh Muscle Cross-Sectional Area. We are obviously going to be talking about the outcome around lengthened partials, which will probably not take too long, but we are both more interested in talking about the wider implications of this particular study, which is fascinating. So just for the benefit of everyone, do you mind just giving an overview of the study and then we can get into the results?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So this is another study that we have done in collaboration with colleagues at Discover Strength. So myself and Dr. James Fisher, that is, have a long-standing collaboration with Luke Carlson and David Schneider and the team at Discover Strength. And we've run a number of these studies with them, which are typically pitched as kind of their Project Discover. So this was last year's Project Discover. And every time we run one of these, we always ask Luke and the team, what's the question you guys are interested in answering this time? And as I'm sure most of the listeners will be aware, a kind of hot topic, for better or worse, in the kind of resistance training, online, quote unquote, evidence-based fitness area is lengthened partial training at the moment. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with what that means, is essentially it is performing partial range of motion repetitions on an exercise where the muscle group is being targeted by the exercise is being trained in a lengthened position. So essentially when the muscle is in a kind of stretched position and a partial range of motion is performed whilst it's lengthened. So Luke was interested in us exploring that. I think he went into it with a similar degree of skepticism as certainly I did. And oftentimes what we end up doing in these studies is kind of busting myths and things like that. So there's a lot of hype around the lengthened partial training at the moment, and whether it does or does not optimize hypertrophy, particularly in trained individuals. We went ahead and decided that we were going to run for essentially a first in our field, a very large-scale, multi-site randomized controlled trial. We had 15 Discover Strength sites involved. We recruited almost 300 participants who were randomized between either a group that performed training with the addition of certain exercises performed using the lengthened partial range of motion, or a group performed just the full range of motion exercises. And like I said, there were specific exercises which we focused on using the lengthened partials for, which are exercises typically they get suggested for. So mostly kind of single joint movements like extension leg curl, and incline supinated dumbbell curl, tricep extension, hammer curl. Whereas the other compound exercises, multi-joint exercises in the programs, and any kind of other accessories were still performed using a full range of motion. But because our primary outcome was arm and thigh cross-sectional areas, so arm and thigh hypertrophy, we focused the lengthened partial component of the intervention on those muscle groups. So we had nearly 300 trained participants who had at least 6 months training experience at Discover Strength. So we knew what that kind of training history was. They performed 12 weeks worth of training intervention, typical Discover Strength approach. So twice a week, everything was single sets per exercise, performed some momentary muscular failure. Typical DS type intervention, which I'm sure most people will be familiar with by now. And like I said, our primary outcome was looking at the hypertrophy, so changes in estimated muscle cross-sectional area. Given that we conducted this at such a large scale, we opted to use anthropometric measures. So muscle size was estimated from measurements of muscle or arm circumference, and then skin folds, and then we estimated using previously validated equations what muscle area would be given those. So it's a technique that has some inherent error in it, although every measurement has error involved in it. But we specifically, when we were planning the study, we put a lot of work into estimating the sample size we would need to be able to detect an effect of lengthened partial training, if there really was an effective lengthened partial training, taking into account the typical variation we see between individuals and the measurement error we know is involved in those measurements, hence why we needed such a large sample size. So that was our primary outcome. We also looked at strength outcomes, which were...
Just pause there for a second, James.
Sure.
Just for the benefit of those who don't know much about Discover Strength, could you just go into a small bit more detail about the actual protocol? You said single set to failure. Could you tell us more about what that looks like, the workout, the number of exercises, maybe speed of movement? Because just for those who aren't maybe coming to this for the first time, maybe they're not from a high intensity training background. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, Discover Strength typically do 2 workouts a week. They're full body workouts. The interventions we used, they're in table 1 of the pre-printed paper, so anyone can take a look at those if they want. Were involved 15 exercises in one workout, 16 in the other, with the main difference being the addition of abdominals in the second, and some variation in exercises between kind of the session 1 and sessions 2 A/B kind of routines. But to give you an example, I can quickly rattle off the exercises. So workout A was seated calf press, leg press with the seat position in the mid seat position. Hip abduction, leg extension, leg curl. They actually, to correct myself, for the lower limbs, they actually did do 2 sets of leg extensions and 2 sets of curl, both to failure with the lengthened partials. Yeah, I know. One of the criticisms we were envisaging was most people saying the usual, like, it's too low volume.
Right, of course.
Yeah. So we added a little bit extra in, but obviously, it's Discover Strength. We can't start throwing 10 sets of things at their clients.
And no advanced overload techniques to keep variables.
No advanced overload. So this was all as clients at Discover Strength who take part in the studies know that they're going to be on a fixed protocol for 12 weeks.
Sure.
So they sign up knowing that. But yeah, so 2 sets of those: chest press, pull down, overhead press, pull over, incline supinated dumbbell curl, French press tricep extension, incline hammer curl, and then core torso rotation. And then the B routine just varied: leg press in terms of more upright seat position. They did abduction instead of adduction. They did dorsiflexion for the tibia, lateral raises, incline press, seated row overhead press, and then finished up with the same incline supinated dumbbell curl, French press tricep extension, incline hammer curl, and then abdominals and the core lumbar spine. So all with the exception of the lower limb leg extension, leg curl, single sets to failure, but all sets were in true Discover Strength style, truly to failure. And we used a load that allowed them to perform roughly 6 to 8 repetitions, using a 2-second, 4-second concentric, eccentric repetition duration. But one of the things that we did was we kept the repetition duration matched between the 2 intervention groups. So the load was adjusted for the lengthened partial group and the full range of motion group, so we're still doing effectively a similar time under load for each of those exercises. But of course, in the lengthened partial range of motion, they would have been moving at a essentially half the speed because they're only doing the first half of the range of motion. So those slight differences as well between the protocols there.
So sorry, that was awesome. So I cut you off. You're about to talk about strength outcomes when I asked you to expand on design. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No. So the other thing I was going to say is, well, first of all, in terms of the hypertrophy outcomes, one of the things we did as well was we took multiple measurements at each time point. So anytime you take a single measurement, that measurement is always a product of whatever the real value is, and then some error involved in the measurement process. And so the more measurements we take at a given time point, the more we can kind of account for that error in the modeling that we do with the statistical analysis. So we had 3 measurements at baseline and 3 measurements at post-intervention. That we actually had 6 measurements at baseline because they did an initial week of testing, then they tested a week later, and then they started the intervention. But for the strength outcomes, we actually had even more data because Discover Strength used the Strength Portal CRM system to track their workouts. And so because this is one of the nice things, and it's a similar benefit that we had, for example, when working with the Fit20 data previously, is that when you're doing single sets to failure, you effectively are doing a repetition maximum test. And so you can use that data, the number of repetitions you perform, the load you use, and essentially estimate, for example, 1 repetition maximum from that. And so what we were able to do is, because we had workout to workout and for all exercises, we had that data, we were able to essentially track strength changes week to week over the intervention. So we didn't just have pre and post, we had like strength data throughout the entirety of the interventions. We had 300 participants, and I forget now exactly the number of strength observations we had, but I have a quick look. So we had sort of anywhere from between sort of 1,500 to over 3,000 strength measurements across those 300 participants across the length of the intervention as well. So our strength outcomes as well were very highly statistically powered, even though they were our secondary outcome. Our main outcome was to look at the hypertrophy. So that's kind of the design of the study and what we looked at. And like you said, we can probably get through the lengthened partials component of the result pretty quickly because there is basically no difference between them. Strictly speaking, and I'll get the technical bit out of the way, we actually set this up to use the kind of technical terminology as a very, very severe statistical test of the hypothesis that there would be no meaningful difference between the 2 conditions. So we went in actually hypothesizing that there wouldn't be a difference. And then we specifically set up our statistical analysis to test that. Whereas normally most studies you see will test to see if there is a difference. And then if they can't reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference, they'll conclude the same, which technically isn't accurate. And I mean, we've done that before in the past, before I knew any better. But we specifically set out to essentially test what would be called statistical equivalence between the 2. But we also really set very, very stringent statistical inference criteria. So typically, I mean, most people will have heard of the kind of, if your p-value is less than 0.05, then it's quote unquote statistically significant. And that is p-value is essentially related to the error rates at which we want to control making like false positive claims, or what we call type 1 error. So for example, if there really was no difference between, or in our case, if there really was a difference between the 2 interventions, if we had everything set up and statistically powered to test and maintain that 0.5 error rate, we would only, if we ran the study over and over and over again, only 5% of the time will we incorrectly conclude there's a difference when actually there is no difference. But we actually set our criteria even more stringent than that. We set it at 0.01 and actually adjusted it between the 2 hypertrophy outcomes because we had both arm and thigh. And so with that very, very stringent criteria, technically our p-value was just above the threshold. So technically our conclusion should be we're not quite sure whether they are statistically equivalent at our very, very strict level of criteria. But if you take a step back and then you use the criteria that the rest of the field accepts as acceptable levels of evidence, there is definitely no difference between the 2, given that. And in fact, when we look at the actual estimates of the effect, so we use what are called standardized estimates for this. And what that does is essentially it looks at the changes or the difference in changes between the two interventions in standard deviation units, which is typically what you might see if you looked at a meta-analysis where all the data is pulled from different studies. Typically, you'll see a standardized mean effect. And that will be in standard deviation. So the reason we did that is because it makes it a lot more comparable to previous big analyses we've done in terms of big meta-analyses, which we talked about on the podcast before. Things like the standardized estimates from our Fit20 data set in terms of strength. And so it makes it more comparable for us. To put it in perspective, our previous meta-analysis has shown that the standardized mean effect for strength is about a 0.9 of a standard deviation. For muscle mass, it's way lower, about 0.34 of a standard deviation. And because there is a 0.34, and this is in untrained people, it's got to be lower in trained people. And then when you take the step of saying, what should the difference be between two interventions, it has to be even lower. And we basically found that the effects between the two interventions are almost a zero standardized mean difference. So we're pretty confident in saying there's essentially no meaningful difference between the two. So do you lengthen partials if you like them? It's not going to magically make you grow massive. And in fact, that gets on to probably the bigger point, which is if you're a trained participant, also the results suggest you don't grow much, whatever you do.
Oh, elaborate, James.
Okay, so this is where I get very excited because I'm a big philosophy of science buff. I would call myself somewhat kind of neo-Popperian in the sense that good science to me is aimed at testing predictions from theory and trying to falsify those theories. And those tests have to be, like I say, really severe tests. They have to be capable of rejecting the theory if it's wrong,
which is lacking in our in the exercise scientific literature.
100%. There's the two things lacking are we typically don't have strong enough theories to make strong predictions about what we even think we should see. At best, we might say, one thing is bigger than another thing or will produce more effect than another thing. But, we're not a field where we make such precise predictions as, say, physics or genetics, where we can say, actually, I think the difference in effect is going to be this much, or it's going to be within this small range. And if you're able to make those very precise predictions, then it's a much more severe test of what your theories are predicting. So to take a step back initially, when we were planning this study, one of the reasons why we ended up with such a big sample size is because, as I said, in our big meta-analysis data set, of thousands and thousands of participants looking across a range of different kinds of resistance training interventions, we see that typically the average effect on hypertrophy is about a 0.34 standardized mean difference. Now, that's over a typical sort of 12-week period. But one of the things we were also able to do is in that set of studies, the studies vary in terms of how long they last for. And so similarly to what we've done previously with the Fit20 data, where we can plot, for example, and model how strength changes over time, we're also able to do the same with the hypertrophy and also the strength outcomes from our large meta-analysis data set, given that each of these studies have different time periods. And so what we find is we've previously shown that for strength, you get what's called a linear log relationship. So over the first sort of, year or so of training, you get very, very rapid improvement. And then it just starts to plateau off until it's basically, technically it's not a plateau because a linear log model will continue for infinity. But practically speaking, you're basically plateaued. And we see the same kind of model fits hypertrophy data very well, which you'd expect. No one grows to infinity. In fact, most people over plenty of years have looked pretty much exactly the same to me, and I've looked pretty much exactly the same since I was,
Well, James, that's because you're not doing German volume training and you're not doing free sets of 10, so
that must be it. It must, except so. But the problem with that is I have done that in the past. I've looked exactly the same. But anyway, so what we're able to do is, we get that kind of say 0.34 difference over that 12 weeks, but then it starts to plateau out. And so what we said is we're doing a study in trained individuals. So they've got at least 6 months training experience. So we can almost ignore that. What we're going to see is from 6 months not 9 months, what's the magnitude of change that occurs in that period of time? And what our data from the previous meta-analysis and the theory that there's a linear log growth, it predicts that the change over time should be about a 0.05 standard deviation, which is obviously a lot lower than what you see than a point.
What does that mean? Just layman translation.
For all intents, so okay, let me give you. I gave this last look at the rec. I had to, this because this is always difficult to try and visualize and understand like what do these differences mean. So let me give you some concrete examples. So we know that men are on average taller than women. That doesn't mean every individual man is taller than any given woman. But on average, there is a considerable height difference between men and women. Well, we can, given the standard deviation of heights in the population and the mean difference between those heights, we can express that mean difference in those standard deviation units. And the difference between men and women, which is plain for the eye to see, like it's a big effect, is a standardized effect of, off the top of my head, about 174 standard deviations. So that's a pretty big effect. So, and to give you an even bigger effect, this is one of the best ones I've seen in the literature. Some psychology studies will do what are called like manipulation checks or things like that, to see whether people are responding to their scales properly and they're not just, plugging in whatever they want, when they're not paying attention. So there's a study where they included a question about people's preference for chocolate or poo. And as you can probably expect, most people prefer chocolate to poo.
No.
And so, it's surprising, right? That has a standardized mean effect of about 4 point something. So that's a really big effect. Like you don't even need to run a study. Most people will definitely prefer chocolate. I'm sure there's some people who that's different for, but on average, people generally do prefer chocolate. Anyway, so let's bring it back to central things. So you've got this scaling, you've got like really obvious effects. You wouldn't even need to do a study to detect, difference in height between men and women on average. Strength, for example, is a 0.9 standardized mean difference. And like we know for a fact, like you almost don't need any more studies to show that people are stronger when they lift weights, when they do resistance training. That's pretty much a given now. It's a very big effect. It's one of the most strongly established effects, I think, in our field, if not the most well-established effect. For hypertrophy, it's a 0.34 standard deviation. And this is where then you can start to feel the difference between when you, for example, even think about your own progress over time. I'm sure you've seen much more drastic improvement when you first started training in how much weight you could lift and how much strength you had compared to how much bigger you look. So it's difficult to scale like exactly. In fact, I'd love to do a study to see what is the minimal standardized mean change that is actually visually detectable to the eye.
Right.
Because I'm somewhat skeptical that even 0.34 is like, you look like you've been lifting weights, but you've got to get to me.
Today's episode is sponsored by Imagine Strength, the game changer in safe, simple, and effective high-intensity training machines. When it comes to HIIT, Imagine Strength is your go-to for intelligently designed, efficient, and affordable equipment. Their team is passionate about HIIT, and it shows in every piece they craft. So why are Imagine Strength the right choice? Number one, they tailor-make their equipment for HIIT studios. Number two, they provide cost-effective solutions for your business. And number three, they are committed to ongoing innovation and refinement. Ready to take your HIIT business to the next level? Visit imaginestrength.com to discuss your needs and find the perfect gear for your studio. Join the HIIT revolution of Imagine Strength and transform your workout experience today. Let's go.
And for anyone who's read, Skylar's classic 7-year itch,
6-year itch, blog post.
For all intents and purposes, after the first maybe year or so of training, maybe even less, like most people don't look much different. They don't grow much more. And the effects that we see, that our theory and previous data predict are about a 0.05 standardized mean effect for muscle growth. Now, to put that in perspective, to be able to detect that effect, you need to have this is where like another reason why our sample size is so big compared to the rest of the field. Like, most studies will have an average of 10 participants per group, so you might be lucky if you see 20 participants. And in previous Discover Strength studies, we've pushed the sample sizes up bigger than the typical in the field. And some studies you're now starting to see are getting a little bit bigger. Maybe you've got 40, 50, 60 participants. But this is really the first one in the field to actually do a proper initial prediction of what the effect sizes we think there should be. So we split this into like, what's the main effect of time? So the main effect over the intervention, independent of which intervention you're doing. Potentially, what's the average muscle growth for, whether you're doing lengthened partials or full range of motion. But then also that main effect, that average effect, constrains what possibly the difference between the two could be. Because if on average it's going like this, for there to be a massive difference between the two, you'd almost need one to have a really extreme effect and one to have a negative effect. We know that people who continue lifting weights don't lose muscle. And so it can only be one has no effect, or there has to be like a small effect. So the between intervention effects are tiny, 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 tiny. So we predicted they can't be more than about, at most, half of that 0.05, 0.025. So these are absolutely minuscule effects. And you need big sample sizes to be able to detect them. So one of the things that we were able to do then is make these very precise predictions. And this is where it gets really interesting, is because most people will generally poo-poo my kind of, the term that gets thrown around is black-pilled attitude to fit things that,
right.
Everything works, and also nothing
I see.
works in trained participants anymore. Look,
I've never heard that, black-pilled. Is that applied to other things as well as exercise?
Yeah.
Nothing matters.
Yeah. Or it's, I mean, it's not like even a cynical view. Like, I've led into it because it's quite funny, just because there's a certain degree of, and I'm sure you sort of recognize it, and I recognize it in myself, like certainly early me, of like this just hopeful want of finding the magic still that's going to just get you those gains. Nothing ever does.
You get a lot of flack for this, do you? For this?
Well, yeah, I think so.
From who? Don't say names, obviously. But what kind of comments?
I mean, just in general, it's never like comments, but I think there's a feeling of like, oh, don't come over here with your rigorous science data that like dashes all of our hopes.
Stop being so negative, James. God.
Yeah, exactly. Let us obsess about the lengthened partials and this, that, and the other.
I've never felt it was negative, actually. Like, we talked about this before. I actually find it quite liberating, because there's still other. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. But please continue. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So, and this is where like a lot of these very small studies that we see now, they'll provide estimates of effects. They don't necessarily, prior to their study, make precise predictions about what magnitude of effect they think they're going to see. And so for all intents and purposes, I don't pay too much attention to them, other than the fodder for one day ending up in a much more rigorous meta-analysis where we can actually start to leverage the combined statistical power of all of those studies. But in our case, we've got a strong study which makes a very strong, precise prediction a priori. We pre-registered it as well. So it's like calling a shot. It's the difference between a study that if you come around, you walk around a farm and you see some guy who's shooting at the side of a barn, and you can see that there's a bullseye, and all of the shots are like within the bullseye. But then you find out that he shot all the shots and then drew the bullseye around them. You'd be far less impressed about it. Whereas if he called the shot and then made it, you'd be a lot more impressed about it. So we essentially did the latter. We called the shot, we did the study, and incredibly, like the magnitude of effects that we saw for both hypertrophy and for strength were incredibly close to what we predicted from our previous meta-analysis data and the theory that growth and adaptation over time in both strength and hypertrophy is linear log in form. And so I think it's a really nice corroborator of that theory. And taking a step back, just thinking about implications for the field in general, there's been a real push in other areas to just do better science and do science a lot more rigorously in the sense that I've described. So Early on in a lot of research fields, a lot of work is descriptive, exploratory. It's aimed at just maybe estimating the magnitude of effects and trying to sort of feel around and figure out what things look like. But then the next sort of step in any scientific discipline really, in theory, should become the development of more formal theories and models to say, what describes the way the world works, essentially. That's how physics has worked, that's how other more powerful quantitative sciences in particular have worked. And very rarely do you see that in our field outside of very, very specific contexts. And certainly not in kind of interventional research relating to things like resistance training. And a lot of the time, there are other adjacent fields like psychology that have gone through their kind of replication crisis, as it's so called. And others have pointed out that there are issues with measurement in that field and there are issues with theory in that field. And one of the problems with it is that they don't have strong enough theories to make precise enough predictions. And so there's been a big push to try and upskill and educate the researchers within that field regarding how to build and test more rigorous formal theories. But there's been a lot of pushback in psychology, and similarly, I see it in this field as well, to say, like, look, we're just not at that stage yet. We've not got knowledge, we've not got previous data, we're not able to make precise predictions. The best we can do is say, I think maybe this intervention will do better than this intervention because in some plausible sounding physiological mechanism.
So just to double click on one thing there that I don't fully understand is this, I think you mentioned a crisis of replication in meta-analyses. Help me understand that. So obviously, in lieu of having a big sample size, that's the purpose of a meta-analysis, right? To bring lots of studies together to try and see if there is a benefit to whatever it is you're studying, right? Or an advantage. And a lot of those have been done, right? Some has been done in resistance training around like volume, for instance, and these kinds of things. What's the problem? Sorry, I mean, you mentioned measurement error is one, and help me understand that better. Yeah.
Sorry. So I'll take us back for a moment there because I jumped too soon into that. I was talking more about the replication crisis in particular. Doesn't necessarily pertain to resistance training or to our field or anything like that. It kind of largely as a kind of idea came out of probably the last 10, 15 years from psychology, because a lot of key findings in that field did not stand up to scrutiny and people were unable to replicate them. And it's opened up a lot of questions about the methods that were being used, including a lot of kind of what are now called questionable research practices. And I should clarify, the reason I say this is because psychology is quite a close field methodologically to what we often do in sport and exercise science. And because they're kind of essentially 10 years ahead of us in terms of realizing that there are problems in the literature and problems in the way that they've been doing science, sport and exercise science has kind of been catching up. And there's few people like myself and others involved in organizations like STORE, Society for Transparency, Openness and Replication in Kinesiology, who have been trying to sort of push the field towards some of these developments in terms of open science activities, pre-registration, like calling your shots, and pre-registering what your analysis plan is, because you've probably heard of the term like p-hacking before, where
I've not heard that.
So it's very easy, like particularly when you're using the kind of statistics we used in this, where you're trying to control error rates that you make conclusions at. If you go in and make any changes to your analysis plan, you add a covariate in your model, or you drop a couple of observations because you think they're outliers, or whatever. You can play around with all sorts of different ways of essentially fishing around it with your data and then rerunning your model until you get your magic. Oh, I've got a p-value of less than 0.05. Now I've found something, I can publish it. So people it's become called p-hacking. People hack their data until they get their significant result, and then they publish it. And if they can't get a significant result, they end up not publishing it, or they can't get it published.
So what's the, sorry, I know I'm skipping ahead here, but what's the real problem with a lot of these meta-analyses then? Is it because that's happened at scale, basically?
So that can be
or is there other variables too?
That can be a problem with meta-analysis, for example, if there's publication bias in the field, because you'll only be getting a snapshot of positive studies. Now, fortunately for us, publication bias isn't, I suspect, is not a massive issue because it's so hard to run studies anyway, even at a small scale, that people, come hell or high water, will get them published somewhere. But more the point I was making is that history of kind of turning a lens inwards on the field and looking at why have we got to this point in psychology where suddenly everyone's questioning these findings. People are starting to ask questions like, what are the methodological things we're doing wrong, and how can we enhance our rigor there to make people more confident in the findings we do report? But also, where have we even got some of these hypotheses from, and do we have strong enough theories in the first place that we can then test in very rigorous studies? And so it was more the point to say that, these are various steps that field's gone to, and they've got to a stage where one of the recommendations have been, if we can make more precise predictions from our theories rather than just, we think that group A will be better than group B on outcome X. That's not a very strong prediction, particularly not a very strong prediction when you're doing an underpowered study and you're p-hacking and you're only publishing it if you find something significant. Then you've got very, very little confidence that any of the significant findings you see in the literature are real effects. Whereas if you have a strong theory that makes a very precise prediction, and then you specifically plan your study such that it can provide a strong, rigorous test of that prediction, and then the theory either is corroborated because the prediction plays out in your study in terms of the effects you find. That gives you more confidence in the technical term is verisimilitude, like how accurate the theory is actually describing what's going on. And if it gets falsified, then great, you've got a falsifier of the theory, and you can go back and think more about, okay, well, how do things really look like they're working, and start to revise it. But the pushback has often been like, we're not good enough yet as a field to be able to come up with these precise predictions. This I think is a really clear example, and also on a really boring topic, quite frankly, lengthened partial training. But the broader theory that there is very small effects, and we predict them in trained populations to be about this big for an intervention of this duration, and we would predict the differences between any two interventions to therefore be this much, are very, very precise predictions that have stemmed from formal theories about what we think the kind of functional form of these effects should take over time, and the precise magnitudes of the parameters in those theories. And, we can derive them predictions and run these strong tests of them. But to take a step back, I think broadly speaking, there's a number of points to make, which is, even if you ignore the theory component, this is one of, if not the biggest intervention studies in the field. And it really shows. I mean, even if you look at, everyone generally agrees that the effects are probably quite small, even if they think those small effects are still meaningful, which I don't. Because there's a difference between the effect is small versus the effect is not meaningful. Because for some person, a small effect, right. I don't think personally they're meaningful. Any of them are meaningful at all. But so there is the fact that we quite clearly show, even in our pre-registration, because I did a lot of essentially mathematical simulations to show if the effects were this big, how much statistical power would we had if we had this many participants, or this many participants, or this many participants, or this many participants. And one of the things I think I said earlier, we tested specifically whether there was equivalence between the interventions, not if there was a difference. And that really highlights a key point as well, because I simulated the statistical power at different sample sizes for if we wanted to test a difference and if we wanted to test for equivalence. Now, we needed 300-ish people to be able to adequately power and test severely whether there was equivalence. If we really wanted to test whether there was an effect of the magnitude that we predicted, we would have needed over 1,000 participants.
Wow.
And so it really highlights that the field is just woefully underpowered in pretty much every study being done.
I'm so excited about, the future research you're going to do at this scale. I'm just aware of time, James, and unless you got something really important you want to say, I've got 2 questions I really want to ask you.
Sure.
Rapid fire, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So, like you were saying earlier about the whole black pill thing, you get to a point with training, you plateau, and then it's just kind of like holding on for the rest of your life. And I'm not saying I believe that, but obviously there are individuals, myself included to a degree, that you can always improve in some dimension with training over time. How do you think about that? Do you think about it like, you know what, I've maximized my muscle mass, my body composition. I'm keeping the table set, as Skylar would say. I'm training. I'm getting all the benefits, the myokine secretion, all the benefits that come from exercise. But I'm just really just maintaining. Or I've heard, I might be misquoting here. I know we've done a podcast with Luke before, and he's talked about improvements in like muscle architecture. So I'm just wondering if there are other markers, other variables that do improve with training over the long term. Maybe muscle hypertrophy, maybe grams. I don't know. Other aspects. How do you think about that? And any thoughts? Yeah.
So I think probably this comes down to as well whether any of these kind of external markers or measures that we can take on ourselves as individuals are useful aids in motivating us. One of the things I try to very clearly differentiate between as well, and people struggle with this concept, so I'm not sure how well I'm going to communicate this, is the causal effects of the intervention that you're doing, which sometimes are so small, may be real, but you can't see them because any kind of measurements you're taking, the error in those measurements will exceed the that anyway. So in an individual, it's difficult to tell whether any improvement has necessarily been because of that one thing that you did in a whole gamut of other things. No matter how well you control everything, it's just almost an impossible inference to make. So personally, like I don't even think necessarily about outcomes anymore, and haven't for a long time in my own personal training. I was actually talking to a PhD student recently, because they feel like they came in all but right and bushy tailed, the full like curtain pulled up, and like this is not how the sausage is made. They're all terrible, and yeah, they've just been like at the blackpilled bottle, just like don't worry, I'm fully bought in, but now what do I do? Do I carry on training or not? And I was saying, for me, like I don't necessarily go in and train. Like I told you before, like I haven't recorded my workouts for years.
Right.
I haven't measured anything for years other than like I weigh myself every morning, and I've been pretty much stable body weight for a long time. And it's a big period where I pigged out. Pigging out for me is like, oh no, I put on like 2 kilos. Really, I think about, I liken it a bit like brushing your teeth. Everyone brushes their teeth every morning. It's just a part of what you do. And for me, like training is like that. But also at the same time, I don't stress out if I miss a training session, but I really enjoy the process of going in and training. For me, it's almost like my meditation. And so I love Skylar's analogy of like keeping the table set. Like I know it's keeping the table set, but I'm not even thinking about that over time. For me, like I go in just because I enjoy the training. And it doesn't matter whether I'm improving from workout to workout anymore, because I'm pretty much not.
It's just the pump. I get it. It's the pump.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even the pump. It's just for me, and everyone knows I'm a bit of a masochist anyway. But I just like going in and having that brief period of time where I challenge myself and push myself to a limit. So I've realized recently, like that's what I do it for. And it's like a mental reset. Yeah, it's spiritual reset, whatever you want to call it. And it works for me that way. But I do recognize, I think to your point as well, like some people can look at this and think like, well, what's the point? Like, what's the motivation to keep doing it? And particularly, like, to be honest, I'm not interested in bodybuilders and people interested in largely aesthetic goals anymore. More, they can obsess over effects that are too tiny for anyone to
We're
care
very
about.
aligned on that.
Yeah. But for your general population, that keeping the table set analogy is really nice, I think. And it opens up a lot of freedom for, if you're someone who loves training and also loves geeking out and playing with different protocols and things like that, even if really you don't believe there's any benefit to doing them in terms of outcomes. You just enjoy trying different things, tinkering with new stuff and things. And to be fair, over recent years, I've got back into that a little bit as well. Like, so I'll still do the basic, AB bodyweight routine, which I've done for the better part of over a decade. Then maybe once a week, if I've got a bit of time, I'll play with some of the toys that I've accumulated in the garage gym. So I might do some deadlifts. I might even do some squats. I'll do some, weight drop set dips and pull. I'll do whatever and play around with some different exercises. But again, it's more just because I enjoy that. And so having that flexibility to like, look, if you're one of these people who wants to make yourself by playing with different protocols and things like that, you can do that. If you're someone who doesn't, then suddenly it's like I can do the most basic routine ever, and it's pretty much going to get me everything I'm going to get, and it's going to maintain everything that I'm going to get over time. I don't particularly like exercise, so great, go with the super efficiency approach and treat it like brushing. No one enjoys brushing. Well, maybe some people do. It just becomes, I've got to do this to keep the table laid and ward off the aging effects.
Yeah. Thank you, James. So fascinating as always. Again, need to wrap up, but I could talk about this for so much longer, and hopefully we'll reconnect very soon. Best way for people to contact you these days and learn more about you?
Probably via my consulting email. So that's james@steele-research.com. People can contact me via that. I mean, I'm still on various social media platforms loosely. So I'm on, not that anyone should go on Twitter anymore or X. But I'm on there at James Steele II, and also on Blue Sky and Instagram, same handles, and LinkedIn. I can't tell where anyone is anymore now that the mass sort of social media migrations have started happening. So
they're just on school. Yeah. They're just on in my.
They're just all on school.
Yeah. school.com/HIB. There we go. That's where they are. No, so yeah, we'll link all that up in the show notes. Thank you for that, James. James, thanks so much for doing this. The work that you do, the work that you do with DS and James Fisher, extremely appreciative of that, and very excited for all the work you've got to come, the stuff you're doing with Keys to Training, other projects you might have with DS. So keep us posted, and we'll talk to you all very soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on again, Lawrence.
Awesome. Thank you. And everyone else, it's Lawrence of highintensitybusiness.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. This episode is brought to you by Imagine Strength, your go-to for safe, simple, and effective high-intensity training equipment. Growing a successful high-intensity training business requires workout equipment that's not only high quality, but also intelligently designed to fit the unique needs of your studio. And that's where Imagine Strength comes in. Drawing on the wisdom of the legendary Arthur Jones, Imagine Strength has crafted a groundbreaking line of fitness equipment that's as affordable as it is efficient, giving your studio the upgrade it needs without breaking the bank. The team at Imagine Strength breathes HIIT. Their passion for high-intensity training shines through in their designs, which they've consistently refined and innovated for optimum effectiveness and user experience. From my personal experience at Rec, I can attest to the careful consideration and craftsmanship that goes into every single piece. My Imagine Strength workout was absolutely brutal, in a good way, of course. Now, what makes Imagine Strength truly stand out? They have innovative equipment tailored for the unique needs of HIIT studios, affordable and efficient designs, lowering the barriers to entry for a HIIT business, continuous innovation and refinement ensuring your studio stays ahead of the curve. Founder Jeff Turner and his team are dedicated to moving the HIIT industry forward and making strength training accessible to more people than ever before. Here's how you get started. Number 1, visit imaginestrength.com. Number 2, discuss your specific needs with the team. And number 3, select the equipment that will propel your business to the next level. Head to imaginestrength.com today and give your HIIT business the Imagine Strength edge. Be part of the HIIT revolution and see firsthand how their unique equipment can transform your studio's workout experience. Elevate your HIIT business with Imagine Strength.